Welcome to this webinar, which looks at configuring costs of sales, stock, purchase orders, and supplier payments within foreCASH. This webinar will be a mix of summary slides and demonstrating features within the live foreCASH program. Costs of sales are associated with sales lines or sales item types. For help on setting up sales, please refer to video reference V4500. Costs of sales in foreCASH relate to stock, materials, subcontract suppliers, and/or in-house labor that is directly related to a sales line. Associating costs with a sales line means that A, you have the option to use the sales value or sales quantity to drive costs, and B, you can see the forecast gross margin on each line. If you have other, less specific costs, such as packaging, which are driven by sales, but where you don't want the cost in gross margin, you can add direct costs. For more on this, see video reference V8500. The main driver of your cost of sales setup, depending on your sales structures, will reflect departments, product groups, sales channels, say trade and consumer, and/or key customers. Your stock forecasting also needs to consider which stock levels are applicable to your business. A manufacturer may have raw materials passing through work in progress into finished goods. A service company may ignore stock entirely, while a wholesaler or retailer would have just one level of stock, as the goods are not altered before sale. In this case, depending on how they classify stock, they could just record stock as either raw materials by supplier or record stock by sales item or finished stock. Each cost of sale is attributable to a supplier or salary line. If a product has costs from, say, 3 suppliers, you may wish to enter cost of sales as a single general weighted cost or split costs into 3 parts. Which of these applies depends on considerations of tax and cash flow. If all of your purchases have the same credit terms, then a simple approach can be taken on cash flow. But if different channels or suppliers have very different payment patterns, you need to consider how to forecast this. Is a weighted mix approach okay, or will the terms variation mean adding extra detail or elements within your cost of sales? foreCASH can model stock-based or import trade lanes. If this applies to some suppliers but not others, this also needs to be allowed for. If some suppliers attract duties, you will need to decide whether extra detail needs to be split out or whether you have to use a weighted average duty rate. Thinking about import VAT, if some suppliers attract import VAT while others attract standard UK VAT, this has an impact on cash flow and the timing of that VAT, and may mean that supplier purchases need to be segregated rather than being treated as a general weighted supplier. We'll look now at some examples. These are being set up manually, but if you have some existing data in Excel, please consider using our Quick Start wizard to save yourself some time. There's more information on that at video reference V7000. Here's an example with a single sales line, and you can see we've got some cost of sales set up already. If I click into the detail, you can see I have one materials or subcontractor element assigned to a general cost of sales supplier, £50,000. If I wanted to, I could add a further element, for example, a labor element at the bottom here, or as I'm going to do now, I'm going to add a second material supplier. The supplier I'm going to choose is a generic one called overseas supplier because I'm, in this case, assuming I want to deal with some import VAT and duty. The method that I can use for calculating these cost of sales is potentially a percentage of the sales price, or I could just type in amounts, or if the item was set up on the basis of unit sales, I could set a cost per unit here as well. There'd be an extra option that would appear, or the last option would be for a data feed amount. So effectively I just feed in amounts from Excel. I'm going to use the percentage of sales price, which is what the most commonly used. And my starting percentage is 25%. So now that I've added that item, you can see that in the month where I have £100,000 worth of sales, I've got an additional £25,000 worth of costs. If I want to, I can vary that percentage by month, an individual month, or if that applies to all later months, I can press the F2 button and it gives me a quick copy. So foreCASH now knows the costs hitting the profit and loss. But in terms of purchases, we also need to consider any stock movements. So let's look at my general cost of sales supplier. The stock can be calculated by either manually setting a stock figure at the end of each month, or alternatively, and again more commonly used, you can use cost of sales or stock days drivers. So if I was assuming that I need to hold 60 days worth of stock for this item, foreCASH will look at the purchases that are coming in the following month and apply the relevant addition. You can also set a maximum stock. So currently foreCASH is assuming I need to buy £50,000 worth of stock to cover the £50,000 worth of cost of sales in the following 60 days from April. But if I apply a cap of the stock holding level to £25,000, you can see it will only buy £25,000 in that month and then wait for the following month to buy what it needs there. And if that persisted, that cap would actually overwrite the level of stock that's being held there. Similarly, you can have a minimum level of stock. So if I apply a minimum there, you can see it's forcing me to buy some additional stock. There's a further element that needs to be considered when looking at cost of sales, and I've got another example here, and that is the concept of purchase order commitments. You can see here I've got a figure of £2,000 of committed purchases. For some businesses, for example, where you import from the Far East, you may well have a schedule going forward 3 or 4 months with known purchase orders that have been agreed with the manufacturer. If you do have that level of detail or information and you do have commitments, then foreCASH allows you to get those into the forecast to make sure you're allowing for the payments which will be generated in relation to those purchases. So returning now to the general slides, there's a summary of some of the elements we've seen there. So we could have a single element, for example, a simple wholesaler may have a single cost of sales element related to a product line. You might have a manufactured item, could have several parts within it. So in this example, we've got some timber, some plastic, some felt, all going into a product. We've looked at using the maximum min days driver to control the level of stock, the stock days, etc. Another feature within that is this little check button at the top here, where you can specify that you may make purchases in multiples or a certain level of multiples of value. So if you're always buying by container load, you can ensure that if a container typically holds £10,000 worth of stock, that you always buy in multiples of £10,000. Mentioned that one of the concerns when deciding what or how much detail to include in your cost of sales elements is whether import duty applies. Import duty can have a rate set by individual supplier and also the terms set for that duty and how you pay it over. And one further thought is that if you have a freight charge which you want to incorporate in the value of your stock, again, that can be specified by supplier. After you've run your stock calculation, run your cash flow calculation, and run a report on the balance sheet, you'll get a summary in your balance sheet of the stock figure. There is at the bottom of the balance sheet section a view stock button which will allow you to export your stock forecast into foreCASH, into Excel. And that will highlight the brought forward amounts, any purchase order commitments, other commitments, and then you can see the usage of materials as you make sales going through your cost of sales line. For more details of purchase order commitments, there is a separate video reference V4800, and we mentioned briefly that you can have salaries as part of cost of sales. Again, there's a separate video on that. V4900 is the reference for that one. Now, so far we've focused on new purchases, and in an example where you get 30 days credit on new purchases, all the payment for your purchase in month 1 would actually occur in month 2. So any cash paid in month 1 will actually relate to opening creditors or supplier balances that you had at the start date of your forecast. Now, there's 2 ways of getting that information into foreCASH. You can import a ledger from your accounting system. So if you do want a lot of detail, or if you're preparing a 13-week cash flow forecast and wanting a high level of precision, that is an option. Details on how to import your ledger are given in video reference V3000. Or alternatively, you can manually enter your opening balance. This mirrors the process for setting up opening debtors, which is covered in video V4500. When you set up your cost of sales suppliers in foreCASH, you can set 2 different terms for them. One is the past terms, which relates to the ledger, which would be your opening creditor ledger balance, and then the new terms apply to new purchases. This means that if you do have a lot of precision in your opening ledger that you've imported, you can use that detail, whereas you might be using a more generic payment terms pattern for your future purchases. There's a number of different approaches if you're not importing your ledger from your account system with every single supplier detail in there. Some people will use a few key suppliers that maybe have extended terms, 60 or 90 days, plus a general or weighted amount for everybody else, just lump those in together. And then that general amount could have a sort of a mixed profile applied to it. So rather than just saying everything's paid after 30 days, looking at an example here, ABC Warehouse has got a term called ledger unwind, and we'll look at that in more detail in a second. Another approach some people use is to just say, well, okay, I'll look at my ledger and split them into 3 groups to say broadly I've got some on 30 days, some on 60, some on 90, and enter an opening balance against a generic supplier group with 30-day terms, 60-day terms, or 90-day terms. And the last option is just to use a single line, so you just enter one amount for your entire opening creditors ledger, and again then used a mixed profile to apply the unwinding of that. And then there's 2 examples of that. You could use a simple unwind profile. So here, this example, I've said that 5% will get paid in 1 month, in the first month of the forecast, and paid on the last day, or you could specify the 15th or the 28th, or whatever is relevant. 75% gets paid in month 2, 15% in month 3, and the balance of 5% in month 4. That's just looking at your total sum. If you've got an aged ledger that you're importing and you want to be a little bit more sophisticated, you could say, well, okay, anything old that I've got in my opening ledger 91 days plus, I'll just assume that all gets paid in the first month. So everything old, assume it will get paid now. Anything that was raised 60 to 90 days ago, let's assume that a reasonable proportion of that's going to come in. So 60% in month 1 and 40% in month 2. For slightly newer stuff, 31 to 60 days, you could say, well, okay, I've still got quite a large proportion coming in if you know that a lot of customers are on 30-day terms, but actually you've got a few that are going to drag their heels. So assume there's a little bit of a unwind profile on that. And then for anything that was raised in the last month, you might say, well, okay, let's assume that's most bulk of that's going to come in the second month. And again, those profiles you can set up based on your knowledge of your own ledger. So I've given you an overview of setting up cost of sales, stock, and supplier payments in foreCASH. There are many other options, over 100 different terms that you can apply to profiles. Our advice would be to start simple and then to refine your forecast as you take into account more detail of the behaviour of particular suppliers. If you need any further help, feel free to contact us via support@forecash.co.uk or via phone on 01 582 766 066. Thank you for watching.